I've got water. I've got loose sheets of paper today because we haven't got too many fans on. You know, Mike and I have been putting it in books to stop the pages going everywhere, but there we are. Last Sunday, before he came to talk about Romans, Michael brought a different passage to us. He brought Matthew chapter 8 to us. A number of you are going to go there quickly, I know. I was going to ask, can anyone remember what he said in that little cameo? But I'm not going to ask the question, because if no one does remember and no one can answer, there's going to be a stony silence. So let me tell you what Michael spoke about for a few minutes earlier in the service last Sunday. And it was quite simply this: the power of God. The power of God. And as I thought this week, what do? I'm not going to carry on going through Romans chapter 6. This little voice said to me, you need to unpack that little parable a bit further. So I'm going to. Matthew chapter 8, verses 23 to 27. Talking about Jesus, what Matthew records for us, then he got into the boat and his disciples followed him. Suddenly a furious storm came upon the lake, so that the waves swept over the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him, saying, Lord, save us, we're going to drown. He replied, you of little faith, why are you so afraid? Then he got up and rebuked the wind and the waves, and it was completely calm. The men were amazed and asked, what kind of man is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. And what have we sung? Our God is greater. Our God is stronger. I'm not going to sing you a solo. Our God is higher than any other. Awesome in power, our God. You've got 5 verses there. I'm going to give you a modern translation of those 5 verses in 10 words. I know it's a modern translation, paraphrase, because it only took place 5 minutes ago. Stu, 5 words. I prayed a simple prayer. God changed, and God changed the circumstances. I prayed a simple prayer. I think I got my counting right. And God changed the circumstances. Sometimes someone bringing a word wants a bit of confirmation it's the right word. I got that confirmation from Stuart. So Stuart, whilst this message is for all of us, it is most definitely this morning for you as well, brother. So look, here we've got Matthew recording for us an incident where his own disciples became more and more aware of the awesome power and authority that Jesus exercised in the midst of their fear and their uncertainty. And isn't that the best way? In the midst of fear and uncertainty, you see power and authority being exercised. The story of the stilling of the storm, as we know it, is a very, very familiar one. Here it's recorded in a little bit more detail in the book of Matthew, but it's also in the other Gospels as well. So here you've got it, and Matthew has gone from 3 parables or 3 miracles of healing, where he's demonstrated Jesus' authority over sin, over disease, and over demons. And he now turns to 3 miracles which show his power. His power. Firstly, over nature, here in these verses, and then over evil spirits, and then lastly, over sin. And this group of miracles just which demonstrates his power and shows us his power, just again shows us how wonderful our God is. All three of the synoptic gospel writers, that's Matthew, Mark and Luke, we call them synoptic gospels because they're a synopsis of story, and you get the same account in each. In other words, you've got three different sets of eyewitnesses recording an account for us. And if you're ever looking at one of those passages, it's worth looking at the same account in the other two gospels, because normally not all the juicy facts are in one, and there's a little bit of a different angle that you'll get from one of the others as well. So in this case it's Matthew chapter 8 verses 23 to 27. In Mark it's Mark 4 35 to 41, and in Luke's gospel it's Luke 8 22 to 25. So here we have the story. It's a very simple and it's a very straightforward account. And for me, this passage, 5 verses, it breaks down into 3 components. So, and just to help us, I've started each one with the letter S. Well, I've actually started it with 2 S's. So the first one, verse 23, setting sail. Then you've got verses 24 and 25, sudden storm. I had to work a bit harder on the third one, by the way. Verses 26 and 27 I called sovereign stilling. In other words, the sovereign power of our God stilling the storm. So sovereign stilling. If that sounds a bit of a mouthful, I wanted to keep to 2 S's to keep it simple for this morning for everyone. So there you are. So look, verse 23, just picture the scene here. After deciding who was ready to go with Jesus, who was willing to follow him, Jesus called together his closest disciples, and they followed him into the boat. He got into the boat, they were on the Sea of Galilee, and his other disciples came with him. You see, what he'd done in the earlier part of this chapter and in the earlier parables was he'd done a little bit of filtering. He'd filtered out those who were just curious or those who were uncommitted. He'd started to raise the bar because he wanted true followers. And in verse 18 of chapter 8 here, he says, when Jesus saw the crowds around him, what did he do? He gave orders to cross to the other side of the lake. Why? Because those who only had a casual interest clearly weren't going to work their way all the way around to the other side. So if there were other followers who came to the other side, they were truly committed. So there we have seasoned seamen. There's another 2 S's for you there. Seasoned seamen getting into the boat with Jesus and following him. Look, those disciples, when they got into the boat with Jesus, they didn't know what was going to happen next. They had no idea. I think they thought no more than this would be an opportunity to further hear teaching from Jesus, to witness his work at first hand, and to enjoy his companionship. In other words, as they got into that boat, and as that boat set off to go from one side of the Sea of Galilee to the other side, they didn't know what the future held, but they were about to find out who controls the future. And they were about to find out in a really dramatic way. So, setting sail. Secondly, look, verses 24 and 25. Sudden storm. So they're crossing the Sea of Galilee with Jesus, and we read what? Suddenly, a furious storm came up on the lake, so that the waves swept over the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. I don't know, maybe you know someone like that who, once they've fallen asleep, they snore loudly, and nothing but nothing will wake them up. At this point, I am looking at everyone in this building other than my wife. But there are people who seem to be able to sleep through just about anything, aren't there? And so here is Jesus. There is this furious storm taking place. And those seasoned sailors go from confidence to lack of confidence, to worry, to fear, to being petrified, and Jesus is still sleeping. The storm is everywhere. The water is flooding into the boat. Jesus would have been getting wet, but Jesus was still sleeping. Now, maybe it's helpful here just to stand back and think about the Sea of Galilee. We hear it mentioned in messages very frequently. But what do we really know personally about the Sea of Galilee? Well, if you've been there, you'd have seen it. If you haven't been there, and I suspect that applies to most, if not all of us, it's a sort of pear-shaped lake. It's about 8 miles wide, and it's about 13 miles long from north to south. But it's a very deep lake. At its deepest point, it's about 150 feet deep. And interestingly, it's 680 feet below sea level. Now, no, I didn't know those facts. I had to look them up, obviously. But if you think about it, it's surrounded by mountains. So you've got mountains and you've got valleys. So it's a flooded, deep valley. The water's flooded the bottom of the valley to the tune of 150 feet, and it's created this lake that runs north to south, that's about 13 miles long and about 8 miles across. And one of the there's the big mountain ranges around it, and one of the mountains there is Mount Hermon, which is about 9,000 feet tall, so considerably taller than the Rock of Gibraltar, obviously. But just gives you a shape of the landscape there. And if you think about this submerged valley surrounded by mountains, it's going to have steep sides coming down to it, isn't it? So when it rains, the rain rushes down, and equally the wind. When the wind blows, you get violent winds. And that's why the Sea of Galilee was known for sudden, severe storms. They come almost out of nowhere. You know, last night, those of us here who look across the bay, at one point at 8 o'clock, you could see absolutely nothing. You couldn't even see North Mole, detached mole. An hour later you could. Why? Because we'd had this sea fog roll in. On other occasions here, we've all seen it with the Levanta, haven't we? The way that the current of air rises rapidly and cools, and so you get the cloud sitting over Gibraltar, and then later in early evening the cold air tends to descend, and suddenly the Bay of Gibraltar, which has been quite calm all day, suddenly starts to get more choppy. Well, you almost need to take that picture and multiply it. Much taller mountains, much stronger winds, and much bigger waves. And we're told here that this air turbulence meant that the wind and the waves were working overboard. And they've measured the height of the waves in the Sea of Galilee, and they've been recorded as being 25 feet high. 25 feet high. Now, as Carol will know and surfers will know, you measure the height of a wave from the back of it, not the front of it. So if it's 25 feet at the back, then it can actually be even taller at the front. And the intensity of the wind and the shaking of the whole boat here. And Matthew, in the original Greek used in this particular passage, The Greek translation of great storm is seismus magnus. Seismus magnus. And it's from the word seismus that we get seismology for measuring earthquakes. So when the passage here talks about a great storm, it's not just nice poetic words. It really was a seriously huge storm. It was such a storm that experienced fishermen were petrified. Those disciples in the boat with Jesus were absolutely petrified. And the boat was taking on water and no doubt was beginning to sink. And it's into that situation that we can peer in. You've got the frantic activities of the disciples trying to bail water out of the boat, and it's a pointless exercise. The boat is filling up with water quicker than they can bail it out. And yet, presumably a somewhat wet Jesus was still sleeping. It's almost comical when you think about the scene, isn't it? That he was there like that. How do they deal with this situation? And so we read in verse 25, here you've got the disciples, fearful of imminent death. What do? They awaken Jesus. We read in the passage, they came to him, woke him, saying, "Save us, Lord, we are perishing." In other words, this was a frantic plea by his disciples. Lord, we're going to die. We're perishing. Matthew, in his account, in chapter 14 and verse 30, adds a few extra words in. He says, "Save us at once, Lord, we are perishing." What's the difference, those two words, at once? I think what it's telling us is that this boat had got so much water in it, the buoyancy balance was almost completely lost. It was about to go under. And at that point, there was nothing that could be done. No, let me rephrase that. There was nothing that humanly could be done. And until he got woken, what was Jesus doing? Yes, you know the answer. He was sleeping. So here we, I think, have an important lesson to bear in mind. Yes, the disciples were scared. Would you and I have been scared in that situation? Let's be honest, of course we would. We would have been absolutely petrified, and everything else that goes with it. And what were they fearful of? They were fearful of their impending death. And there's 2 points that come out of the story as I've unpacked it so far. First of all, there's a lack of understanding on the part of the disciples as to what their mission was to be and God's ability to protect them. Of course it was early. He hadn't long called them as his disciples, but they hadn't really grasped, firstly, what their mission was and the fact that God would protect them. And the second part of this is that it's often when we're in fear, we call to him to help us. It's true, isn't it? When we're not in fear, sometimes we think we can sort problems out ourselves. But when we have no other option, sometimes we perhaps rely on our Father God too much as an emergency phone line than a regular form of communication, communion and fellowship. They knew who to go to. They maybe hadn't really grasped the mission, but they knew for some reason they had to appeal to Jesus. So they woke Jesus up as he was there in the boat. And interesting reaction from Jesus. He's been asleep. He gets woken by the disciples. He's not immune to the fact that the boat is full of water. and about to sink. In that situation, what would you do first? Well, I think if I had his power, I would have told the wind to stop, sent the waves away. But he didn't. First of all, he rebuked the disciples. Then, secondly, he rebuked the sea. He showed his authority and power over nature. Why did he do it that way? Why not still the storm first and then talk to the disciples, having shown them your power? I'd have done it that way, because I would have then been able to say to the disciples, look, everything's fine. I'm in charge. Look at the evidence. But he didn't do it that way. He started by rebuking them for their lack of faith. And I believe he did that for this reason, because sometimes we will be in circumstances where the waves we face seem so big that we just default to fear. And I think what he was saying to them, it was, when fear seems to be taking hold, that more than ever is when you need to exercise your faith. And we all do it, and that's why I'm making the point. I think it's a really important lesson. The natural thing, the human thing for us to do in really difficult situations, when we can't see any human way out, is to fear. And what Jesus is saying, I am here. I am all powerful. In those moments, don't be a prisoner to your fears. Instead, be a person of faith. Be a person of faith. And that really is the message of sort of 26 and 27, sovereign stilling, isn't it? Jesus here stilled the storm. Now, if you've been shaking a large amount of water around and you suddenly stop doing it, the water doesn't stop slopping around. It's like this pendulum that's lost its power. It just slowly winds down, doesn't it? Not this. He told the waves to cease, and the waves cease. Gosh, I'd like power like that, wouldn't you? I was trying to think of other examples of this, because it's an important point for us, because we don't tend to think of things that way. If the sea whipped round here in the Bay of Gibraltar is rough, it takes days before it's calmed down. It's days before you can clearly see the bottom of the seabed again at shallow depths, because everything's been stirred up. But here, Jesus' power over nature was such that he gave the word and the waters were stilled. And my friends, if this is the powerful New Testament illustration of it, let me remind you of what we find in Jonah chapter 1 and verses 1 to 16. And I've slimmed I've abridged the verses here, it's a little bit shorter. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because of its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed to Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a boat bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed from Tarshish. Why? To flee from the Lord. Then the Lord, surprise, surprise, sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All of the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God. After that, they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone down below deck, where he lay and fell into a deep sleep. But some familiar parallels here, aren't there? The captain went to him and said, "How can you sleep? Get up, call upon your God. Maybe he will take notice of us so that we will not perish." The sea was getting rougher and rougher. So they asked him, What should we do to make the sea calm down for us? Pick me up, he said. Pick me up and throw me into the sea, and it will become calm. I know that it's my fault that this great storm has come upon you. Then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and guess what? The raging sea grew calm. Another instance of God's power. And God wasn't physically present on that occasion to storm the sea. Now, let's go back to the Sea of Galilee. This storm was not created because the disciples had been disobedient. The context here is different. But what is not different is this. Our God is stronger. Our God is greater. Our God is awesome in power. Those things, my friends, remain true. Their question, what kind of man is this? That even the elements of nature obey him. Oh, I'd have loved to have seen it. I'd have loved to have been in a sheltered area on the side, away from the wind and crashing waves and sea spray, and just watch the scene go from what disaster to tranquility. I'm a fairly practical person, and my faith tends to strengthen when I see things physically. We're all a bit like that. That would certainly have strengthened my faith if I'd seen this miracle in action there. But we have the benefit of this and the other miracles that took place recorded for us in the Gospels. My friends, let's not treat these as nice stories. They're not just stories. They are real events that took place, and they're a testament to the power of our God. So, setting sail, sudden storm. I sort of threw in seasoned sailors as well, didn't I? And sovereign still in. I know it's a tongue twister, that one. Let me finish this way. How do we apply this to ourselves? Because what I've done is I've walked you through the passage, and I've opened up what the words in these 5 verses say. But what does it actually mean? How do we apply that to us? Well, we're Jesus' disciples as well, aren't we? It's just a little bit further on in time. We're not his disciples at the time he walked this earth. He's called us later to be his followers. But we must also focus on the power that he has, and not the power of life's storms, because life's storms disappoint us and on occasions can overwhelm us. We should marvel and realize that he is more than we could ever imagine him to be. Jesus took this raging storm and treated it as a demonstration of his power. He challenged those who had little faith. He challenged those with faith to nurture their faith. And what we should do is ensure that we too take lessons from this. Look, there are stages in our lives where there are no storms, no crisis, and everything feels great. But then there are other times when we go through storms. There are several of us here today going through storms of different kinds individually. As a fellowship, we are going through some storms of uncertainty as well. In those storms, my friends, let's look up and not look down. It's important we realize that we are children of the living God, the awesome, all-powerful God. We will get to our wits' end on times. We will doubt. We will lack confidence. He doesn't change. The same God who stilled that Sea of Galilee 2 years ago can still any of the storms in our lives today. He may not change the circumstance. He may give us more faith to deal with it. He may help resolve it. It's his decision how he acts in those circumstances. But our God is all powerful. And we need to remember that when life and the devil throws his worst at it. Jesus was asleep in that boat, physically, but he wasn't unaware of what was going on. He revealed himself at exactly the right time. And sometimes when there are difficulties, our timing for God's resolution will not be his timing. We will be impatient. He may want to test us a bit further. We need to remember that as well. So we must realize, to put it in the context of this little cameo of 5 verses, that what we take from this is that the object of our faith is that we get to that other side of the lake. At the moment, it's individual circumstances and events. One day it will be a bigger lake, and that lake will take us to be with him. And that is, I was going to say that's a fearful thing. And there is an element of fear and uncertainty. There's a tremendous element of hope to it as well. And, he is testing us along the way. But he's testing us for our own good. He's encouraging us in the way he chooses to encourage us as well. So my friends, this morning, let's remember our God is greater, our God is stronger, our God is higher than any other. He's awesome, and he is, above all, our God.